Hello and welcome to Americans Learn. My name is Lauren, and today I am going to be looking at a member choice video. This is warrior women. Were they real? The Amazons, Scythians, and Sarmatians in Sarmatians? Sarmatians? In myth and history. Never heard of those last ones. Heard of the other ones. But are these warrior women real? We're gonna find out today. I mean, I bet there were at the very least women who fought alongside the men, like maybe there weren't or the Valkyrie type things. Maybe it wasn't like that where it was like an all woman group of warriors, but I'm sure there were at least cultures that did have the women do a lot of the fighting. But anyway, let's find out.
For various reasons, these Scythian videos have been delayed, but we're finally getting back
Scythian,
to them.
okay.
And this particular video, as you may have guessed from the title, is going to be exploring Amazons and the idea of female warriors. Now that being said, I just want to get one caveat out of the way. In the thousands of years of human history, there have been a lot of cultures and a lot of civilizations. So, in discussing female warriors here, I am strictly sticking to the classical world and, by extension, the Scythians. This is going to be a broad overview of the topic, but if you're interested in doing a deep dive, I've included the sources in the video description, but my aim for this particular video is one of a more conversational tone rather than anything super formal.
Cool.
So then let's dive right into this. Who, exactly, were the Amazons? Well, the Wikipedia page actually sums this up more succinctly than I can. So to paraphrase the opening paragraph of that page on the Amazons, they were a culture of warriors centered around women who were very well known for both their hunting skills and their martial prowess, and they show up all over Greek mythology. But as the saying goes, where there's smoke, there's fire. So does this idea of a culture of female warriors have any actual basis in historical fact? The extremely short, one-word answer to that question would be yes.
Okay,
it's
cool.
a yes that's going to be quickly followed by
yes, but. Yeah, I figured it's a yes, but. That's what I was kind of thinking. I was like, I kind of remember hearing some stuff about like the Amazons, but I don't remember it. But I know, like, they showed up everywhere. But again, part of that could be just because it happened once and people were like shook by it. So they like painted it, and it was like, it wasn't necessarily a forever experience. But there's also been lots of times too where it's like the women, beat off the pirates or the bandits. Don't use that. The women beat back the pirates and the bandits or whatever from their town because the men were away at war. So the women were there to do, like, they were there for defense purposes. They knew how to defend themselves and their stuff, but they weren't necessarily the military, That's
because, well,
what I remember
evidence
anyway.
for this, the evidence is variable. Unfortunately, we don't get a nice, simple answer outside of that one word yes. The first form of that evidence are textual sources, mainly Greek. Of those texts, the earliest that we have is the Iliad, which is usually dated to the 8th century BC in terms of actually being written down, but which is itself possibly older.
Oh, cool.
And which also contains fragments of other stories from earlier periods, dating to probably the Bronze Age.
Wow, so I didn't realize it went back that far.
What we find is a fragment of a story known as the Bellephron, named after the main character and the Greek hero, Bellephron. The Amazons do show up here, and then they show up later in the Iliad as well, where the poet Homer describes them as being quote-unquote equal to men, in terms of combat and fighting.
High praise.
In addition to Bellephron, Achilles comes into contact with them and he kills their queen. And despite ongoing debates about the historicity of the Trojan War, the city of Troy certainly existed, and there are destruction layers, so is the Iliad accurate to any degree? If it is, when did it happen? That sort of thing. The Amazons here are generally considered to be part of the mythological aspects of the text.
Right. And also, I feel like a lot of the texts from that time, like, even if it was talking about a historical event, it was always highly embellished. Like, they went more for vibes than, like, the way we think of, like, fact. You have to like follow everything from point one to point two to point three and like, source everything. Cause like it was more about this is what happened, but like, how did it feel? Like it was also supposed to like invoke emotion in you and like, and at least part of that, I think, is because of the oral tradition. It's easier to remember stuff if it makes you feel something. So, and again, I might just be pulling that one straight out of my ass, but like, I feel like that is what I've heard before. I think that I've learned about it like that, like Middle Ages before that. History was written to be told and to impart a tale or a story or a moral, but it didn't need to be fact to fact, like 100% word for word, this is what happened, like step for step, beat by beat. And I feel like, like we know Troy existed and it was destroyed at some point. So like how much of this is accurate, how much is not, like how much was seen one time, someone saw like this like platoon of women doing a good job fighting and was like, hey, sick, I bet they've been doing that for 1,000 years and this must be a martial culture, like something, I don't know.
And if nothing else, it at least shows that the idea of Amazons and women warriors were present in the Eastern Mediterranean, and especially
a long time ago, yeah,
since at least the early Iron Age, and probably the Bronze Age as well.
Yeah, which is crazy.
The Trojan War is generally dated to about 1200 BC, and that's a broad date. Depending on which scholar you're reading, that might move around by 50 to 70 years.
Because again,
but the point is that the Amazons
calendars changed. Like, again, they weren't necessarily so focused on specific dates. Like, it can be very hard to date stuff, like events, not necessarily the things. Like, we can date the jugs and stuff. But like, it can be hard to date actual events specifically.
Been around for a while. They also show up in the labors of Hercules and in the voyages of Jason and the Argonauts. Moving away now from mythology and towards recorded history, we of course have the extensive writings of Herodotus dating to the 5th century BC, as well as earlier documents from the 6th and 7th centuries BC, which all do two things. The first is that they all locate the Amazons and their capital not along the steppe to the north of the Black Sea where the Scythians are, but rather in Pontus, approximately the northeastern Black Sea coast of modern Turkey. And while the Amazons were scattered around the area, their capital was located at Themyscira. So how did the Amazons move from there?
I feel like DC has ruined me. I thought it was Themyscira.
There to the steppe, where we tend to think of them, and where the Scythians were, and where the two have sort of been conflated in popular memory. There are a few accounts which differ on the details, but all of which tell us that the Amazons were defeated somehow in a battle, and that they then either fled to the Caucasus Mountains and then moved to the steppe, or that they overpowered the ships on which they were being held captive, and later settled on the Eurasian steppe. Either way, the Amazons subjugate local tribes, become expert equestrians, and continue their practice of mating with men
girl boss,
for a year, keeping
gotta
the
love
women and sending away the men. There are problems that arise here, however. The first issue is sort of abstract, and it deals with culture and the nature of textual sources, especially from antiquity. In reading these texts, what we're doing as a modern, non-ancient Greek culture is engaging in what anthropologists call the Oedic view. Essentially, we are outsiders to the culture, and no matter how much studying or care we put into it, we are never going to be able to fully understand the culture in question like we would our own, simply because we're not part of it. It's so long ago that we are simply divorced from the mentalities that shaped it.
And that's where it becomes difficult when you're like even modern day stuff, where it's like you're trying to like read ancient or older texts, even like the Bible. People try to interpret that, but it's like, but you have to like think about what the culture was like at the time of writing, and things change, things are, different words mean different things. There was like different expectations. Like you have to at least try to like think about old texts like that from the point of view of the person writing it. And that's not the same as being like jokes in 2010 that were like, sexist or whatever, or like homophobic or something, and people laughed at them then. It's like, people are like pussies now or something. It's like it, they weren't the best, like we have to like be honest. It's like, yeah, we laughed then. That was the culture of the time. It's not the same thing as that. I'm saying that this is very different. than that. Weird tangent to get into. I didn't mean to, but like either way, it's not the same thing. You have to look at this stuff as we have to try to be like, okay, but what would they have been thinking and doing? And we do absolutely think about it from a modern perspective, and you can't do that.
That's neither good nor bad, it's just something we need to be aware of. To go a little further here, we don't even have the culture, quote unquote, we have a text from the culture in question, which itself is
even
not
less
necessarily going to be objective. History writing in the classical world was expected to adhere to certain literary tropes and motifs and to structure itself along older, more respected works. So, just as an example, is a description of a battle actually how it played out, or is it structured that way to sound like another battle, like, say, Marathon?
See, that's what I was talking about earlier.
In mind with this particular topic, because it deals with three subjects.
They didn't write it the way that we think about it.
And warriors. The ancient Greeks understood themselves to be, in a word, civilized. And the farther you moved outward from Greece, the less civilized you became. This is why, when you read somebody like Herodotus, you read about descriptions of things that are not exactly human, but not exactly monsters, something in between. When he writes about groups of people living to the north of the Scythians, who were culturally related to them, but who also engaged in cannibalism. And the farther you go from those people,
Yikes,
you
I didn't know
eventually
that.
encounter monsters in the Greek conception of the world. So the point with this is that the farther you go from the Greek world, the more alien things become to the Greeks. And you begin to see in the textual sources the inversion of what, to the Greeks, would be considered normal. Hence legends and motifs of female warriors and men being subservient to women. Because in Greece, it was usually the other way around.
Right.
But starting in the 7th century,
Okay, that's
BC,
interesting.
and then really picking up in the 6th century, the Greeks began to come into closer and closer contact with the other, the nomads of the steppe, because the Greeks began to establish colonies along the coast of the Black Sea, bringing them into cultural, political, and military zones where the Scythians dominated. Now, if you were to, say, Google the Amazons or the historicity of female warriors, something along those lines, you will eventually stumble upon the Scythians and later the Sarmatians.
Sarmatians,
Who apparently had
okay.
female warriors in their culture, and this is where the archaeology comes into play.
Gotta love archaeology, let's go.
Keep in mind, however, are those Greek texts and Greek stories about Amazons and women in arms. Because in terms of documents, that's generally what we have. That is to say, we have a textual record about female warriors derived from a culture for whom anything like that is very much not normal, and they sometimes make it out to be a big deal in the sense of the Amazons being a whole tribe of women warriors. In other words, you can very much get the sense that this was a presence the Greeks felt was on the steppe. But we need to exercise caution in taking archaeology to whatever degree it exists, and trying to match it to the textual record. It's not so much that the archaeology proves or disproves the idea of female warriors in Scythian culture, so much as the scale can possibly be distorted. So let's talk about
that
the
is interesting.
archaeology.
Because like the idea of it just like it's because it's from far away. So again, like it might have just been that there was a few of them. There might have just been a couple of women fighting, but the Greeks were like, "There's women," you know, and like that's interesting. That's interesting.
The Scythian world stretched from the coast of the Black Sea across the steppe to the Saiyan Mountains, and eventually, some Scythians would move into the Carpathian Basin, and others would establish hybrid Indo-Scythian kingdoms in northern South Asia, at least for a little while. The archaeology then ranges across an extremely wide area, but for the purposes of this video, we are concerned with Scythian archaeology along the Pontic-Caspian steppe. The archaeology of the Caucasus tells us that the Scythians were present there since at least the second half of the 7th century BC, and that they were especially concentrated along the Kuban River Valley. The Scythian presence on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, however, only begins to date from the very late 7th and the early 6th centuries BC, so slightly later, with a full Scythian presence only occurring really in the 5th century BC. In that entire area, there are over 3,000 kurgans, raised mounds denoting burials, but only 60 of those kurgans date to the 7th and the 6th century.
Oh, wow. That's like almost not... Still, the fact that there's still... there are still like, the fact that those still exist, even if there's only 60 of them from that long ago, is crazy.
Archaeology tells us that the Scythians, while maintaining their nomadic ways of life, also began to become more sedentary,
Because they were
founding
burying.
or
Yeah.
occupying cities and towns, and establishing closer connections not only with the Greeks, but also with the farming communities along the forest belt to the north, who in turn adopted aspects of Scythian culture like patterns of dress and burial customs. This is also where Scythian archaeology begins to overlap with the archaeology of the Sarmatians, an incoming people who appear to have been culturally similar to the Scythians, but who nevertheless replaced Scythian hegemony on the Pontic-Caspian steppe after about the 5th century. Although you'll often see this period referred to archaeologically as late Scythian due to the similarities in culture. It
Okay.
should be noted here that Scythian artwork appears to strictly feature men when warriors are depicted, but despite the apparent lack of female representation, we know of at least 40 Scythian graves which contain the bodies of women buried with weapons.
Nice.
Unfortunately, I don't have the space in this video to go over all of them,
okay.
but a couple of
Just a couple,
examples
just a
should
few is fine.
suffice. One of the burials in a collection of kurgans known as the Three Brothers Group, dating to the 4th century and located near modern-day Kerch, is notable here for 2 reasons. The first is that this actually contains one of the most intact Scythian bows from any period, and the second is that the body in the burial is female. Another example of a burial containing, this time not just 1 but actually 4 women, comes from a site near the Russian village of Devista. This is mound number 9 as it's known, and it's one of 19 such burials near the village. It has unfortunately been robbed at some point in the intervening 2.5 millennia, but it does contain the bodies of 4 women. The youngest was either 12 or 13 at the time of burial. The oldest was between 45 and 50.
I feel like I literally just read about this. I feel like this, like the young girl. I was like, I feel like that. I just read an article about that. Ooh, that's fun. Okay, I don't know. I don't remember where exactly I read the article, but I do know I recently read an article about this mound, I believe.
And the other 2 were somewhere in their mid-20s. The oldest woman...
Yes, because I've seen this picture. There was the horse riding, and that's why she's like set like this, because died on the horse. Yes. Oh, sick. Okay.
Was buried with an iron dagger, as well as several arrowheads, which presumably were once attached to arrow shafts which have since decayed, while one of the other women in their 20s was buried with 2 spears. It's possible the other 2 had weapons which were subsequently stolen when the tomb was robbed, but we are not sure. Now, ordinarily, it would be wise to exercise caution here. Just because somebody is buried with an object, like, say, a dagger, that does not necessarily have to mean that the individual in question was a warrior or a soldier. It's possible that whatever object you're looking at has some different meaning in the culture being studied when it's interred with a body versus when it's used by the living.
Fair.
And for a long time, since at least the 1930s when Scythian kurgans really began to be opened, that was the general view. These tombs had been ransacked and robbed. So the fact that the 2 examples brought up a moment ago had 4 complete female skeletons in one, and a partially complete female skeleton in the other, plus a bow, and that these have survived over 2,500 years in the condition that we have them today is, frankly, amazing.
A little bit, yeah.
It's just one of those things you need to be aware of and need to keep in mind. We're talking about events and cultures from thousands of years ago, and the fact that we know anything about them at all is in some ways nothing short of astounding. And it is precisely because the Scythian kurgans are in such poor conditions that the idea of warrior women was not exactly taken seriously for so long. Archaeologists may very well have excavated dozens of graves with women and their weapons in them, but because they've been ransacked, all they may have is 1 or 2 bones, which does not necessarily tell them anything at all. However,
Not really.
with the advent of DNA sequencing and other related techniques, we now know that over 300 of these partially complete skeletons, which do have war wounds, and which are buried with weapons, are in fact female.
Wow, okay, that's so cool. All right. Ooh. All right. So I mean, like, again, it's possible that it was just like they were allowed to join the army, you know? Or it's possible that they were protecting somebody and then they knew what to do to defend themselves and they were able to do at least something. At least one of the women, like I'm trying to remember from the Scythian mound of the article that I read, I think that they decided that the 40-year-old one, the oldest one, was probably like someone a little bit more important, and the others may have been her retinue, something like that. Like, but I wish I remembered more about that article.
Moving on from the Scythians to the Sarmatians, who may or may not be the same people as the Sarmatians who came slightly later, we have further evidence of warrior women. Pseudo-Hippocrates, an anonymous writer so named because the texts are included in the Hippocratic corpus, tells us
But
the
it's
following
fake
about these
Hippocrates.
people and their female warriors. In Europe, there was a Scythian race called the Sarmati. Their women ride on horseback, use the bow, and throw the javelin from their horse, and fight with their enemies as long as they remain virgins. They do not lay aside their virginity until they kill 3 of their enemies, nor have any connection with men until they perform the sacrifice according to the law. Whoever takes to herself a husband gives up riding on horseback unless she is obliged to by the necessity of a general expedition. At the very least, it would appear to further back up the assertion that the Sarmati, like the Scythians before them, had a culture in which women could become warriors.
Yeah. Okay.
At the site of
But as long as they're not
50 warrior
fucking.
graves have so far been excavated, and 4 of the warriors have been confirmed to be female. Going a bit further, approximately 1/5 of all Sarmatian warriors that have been excavated have now been confirmed to be women. An example of
20%, that's
burial ground
wild.
in Volga, near the Russian-Kazakh border, where about 94% of all the male graves contained weapons, but so did about 14% of all female graves excavated in the cemetery, indicating perhaps that this was indeed a warrior burial ground. The investigation of Scythian and Sarmatian burials is an ongoing process, with several dozen being examined to varying degrees over the past 3 years. And as that investigation continues, it would not surprise me if our knowledge of warrior women in the region continues to evolve. Despite the mythologizing and the othering aspects of the Greek worldview when it came to the steppe north of the Black Sea, there does appear to have been some truth to tales of warrior women and Amazons riding along the grasslands and the Pontic coastline.
Cool. Awesome. Because I kind of thought I was gonna find out that no, actually, it was probably nothing. But no, it seems like they were allowed. They were allowed to do their thing. And again, because we're not gonna know. It's so difficult to understand, what happened back in the day, because again, it was thousands of years ago, which is still so wild to me. Which is why I'm like, again, things change culturally so quickly too. Like I made a reference earlier to like humor in the 2010s and like people making jokes now. And if you make a joke from the 2010s now, you're much less likely to get a laugh, because it's like the people who you were making those jokes about have come out and said, actually, that's not funny. Please don't. So it's like just even little things like humor can change so quickly. So thinking like about cultural shifts over thousands and thousands of years, it's wild. It's so crazy. And I like the fact that they didn't write history in the way that we write history. It was, again, he said it too. It's tropes. It's like making it memorable in a way that it's like, yeah, no, this was a battle that happened, but like it has to fit into a certain vibe. Like they were going by vibes, like I said. So I was glad to have a little bit of validation there when he said it too. That was interesting. That was the historian's craft. I'm gonna give it a little like. Hey. Thank you again for suggesting it. I did enjoy that video. If you want to see more stuff like that, go ahead and let me know. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.